All right. If you look at the Moodle site, you will now see that there should be an assignment that's visible. It's what I want you to do for your next assignment. It's not time bound in the way the last assignment was. I like to kind of mix things up a little bit. It's just an essay. You have, it's open notes, whatever you have. Um, and it's due by Sunday night at 11 p.m. Okay, which should give you plenty of time to do it. When you see the description of the assignment, I think you'll agree that it's not something that should be a hassle for you to get done by Sunday night. I mean, the only issue might be if we have a catastrophic internet failure or something like that, but we haven't had one of those in a while. So maybe I shouldn't have said that. It's jinx us. Not being superstitious, I will press ahead. One of the things I will mention about that, though, is no one yet has talked to me about that being a late assignment. If you don't, as the prompt says, if you don't have explicit permission from me, which means something you could verify in an email, okay, then you don't have permission to turn the assignment in late. If you don't turn it in on time, then you don't get credit for it. It's not like you can suddenly decide, oh, I guess I blew that assignment off. I better get a hold of you. That tends not to work well. And it's not fair to your colleagues who are trying to meet the deadline and get the assignment in on time. So keep that in mind. And what all we really need to do then is really quickly kind of go through and review. Maybe we'll do that with specific reference to the elements of the assignment. One of the things I ask you to do in the prompt is I say, when you're developing your response, keep in mind the following, and then I list different concepts. These concepts might apply to one or the other of either Plato or Aristotle. You might be able to make them apply to both. You might, if you really want to do well on the assignment, you might be able to draw a contrast between the two thinkers. That's the best approach to the assignment in terms of really being able to demonstrate to me that you understand these two thinkers, is by showing how one is significantly different from another. You show me a certain level of comfort and flexibility with the information. So one of the things is justice. Now, that's particularly important when we think about Plato, because as we discussed, the whole purpose of the Republic was to try to define and explain and explore this concept of justice, okay? What is Plato's theory of justice? You've had time now, you've had discussion on it, you've had time to read the notes where it's spelled out, and you've also had a video on justice.
In the notes, he talks about it, what says a principle of specialization, so that like each person fulfills that role that nature has given them and doesn't sort of interfere in the business of others. So like if you're more fitted to be a producer, then you are a producer, you fill that role. If you're an auxiliary, a warrior, then you fill that role, and that sort of creates a harmony within the city or a society.
Okay, Owen's pointed out a couple of things that are important to remember if you want to nail this thing. One is it is a society characterized by specialization derived from an understanding of everyone's true nature. Okay, so everyone has a true nature. And, the consequence of that nature is there's some part of society for which you are best suited, within which you can make the most productive contribution. Okay, and depending on, the nature of your own soul and, how much you're motivated by, for example, how much you're motivated by a desire for wealth as opposed to a willingness to sacrifice and a desire for glory, or a desire to pursue the truth and achieve wisdom, you're going to fit into one of those different strata of society naturally. Okay, and as a consequence of that, a healthy society is a society in which those three strata or elements of society are in harmony because everyone is following her true will, her true nature. This is the thing you're suited to do, okay? So that's his theory of justice. And so along with that, you'd have to ask yourself, well, at least in the notes we've looked at in the discussions we've had, does Aristotle really offer in this book, in the Politics, a theory of justice? Is there anything in there that he says where he talks about justice? A simple yes or no will do to begin. Okay. Sarah's hedging her bets. She's like, not that I recall. Now you are a politician. To the best of my recollection is the appropriate phrase there, Sarah. There you go. But that's okay. No, really, no. He's not talking about justice. If Plato's primarily talking about justice and what Owen suggested, sort of harmonizing these essential three elements of society to make a healthy city, and that's the focus, and let's say it is, for our purposes, the focus of the Republic, what's Plato talking about? What is he trying to teach us? He's not trying to teach, let's assume that he's not trying to teach us about justice. Then the question is, what is he trying to teach us? What are we supposed to learn from him?
Seems like they both talk a lot about what creates a healthy society, and they talk about a balance. You know, Aristotle talks about a balance between two extremes. Plato talks about a balance of three different parts of the soul that is also applied to a city.
Okay. What is the balance? The balance of what is Aristotle talking about? What are the things that get out of balance or that can be harmonized to either make a chaotic city or an unstable government, or to make a harmonized, healthy city, according to Aristotle? What are the things that he's concerned with?
Well, the middle class, mostly, in the kind of constitution that, that depends on, I guess, what you have in that city.
All right. Why is the middle class important to Aristotle?
It's less prone.
Work today?
I guess it's like less prone to factionalization.
What factionalized on the basis of what, though?
Well, he says it contains like the richest of the poor and the poorest of the rich.
What do we have to worry about with rich and poor people?
Like class interests and taking sides.
The idea of interest. Okay, so if the concern with Plato, thanks, Owen, if the concern with Plato is harmonizing the natural elements of a society, those who produce, those who protect, those who guide through wisdom or lead, okay? The challenge for Aristotle is really much more mundane. In any society, there are interests. There are class interests. There are the interests of the poor, who are almost always the largest cohort in any society. There are different and often conflicting interests of the rich to protect their property, to protect their wealth, not to allow other people to make them insecure in their possessions of their property and wealth. And so in order to kind of harmonize a society and balance those interests, what Owen was talking about is, okay, Aristotle says, if you have a large middle class, you can do that, because the middle class is by definition a fusion of those interests, because it's the richest of the poor and the poorest of the rich. Within that class are embodied all of the interests of the poor and the rich. In fact, they are an organic harmonization of those interests. So they are a built-in stabilizer of a society. They are the mean between extremes. And, even more so than Plato, Aristotle, in all of his philosophy, and clearly in his political philosophy, discusses this notion of the importance of the mean between extremes. You have to avoid extremes. And what he suggests is that really the only way you can do that, and this is his idea of what's called a polity, is if you have a large middle class balancing the interests of rich and poor. Then if you have that, and this is the other point that Owen brought up, for which you all owe him a beer now, is that you make a constitution, right, or a more or less standardized institutional arrangement of power, so that the people most involved in a given interest or phenomenon or need are the ones deciding it, okay? That is not, by the way, what we have in the United States. You might look at what he's saying and say, oh yeah, that's our three branches of government. It's nothing like that. It is absolutely nothing like that. It's not. So I'm exaggerating to make a point. Don't refer to those as like the American three branches of government. That's incorrect. What he's trying to say is that there are different significant issues that arise in public life. Okay, some of those involve, crimes against society. Okay, crime against society should be decided by society. It should be adjudicated by society. Okay, but if you're talking about making law, that should be left to the people who best understand how to make law, and that's not most of society. But when those are people who can make law are making law, to the extent that they do not write that law to advance their own interests, they escape corruption. So the importance of this idea of harmony is you're trying to minimize, because you're never going to completely eliminate, you're trying to minimize corruption. And that's why, Aristotle gives us these types of government, right? These ideal forms of government. You remember there's monarchy, there's aristocracy, and there's polity. But for each of those, he also outlines a corrupt form. And in each case, that form of government is corrupted by a specific individual or class interest. Okay, and that is, the society is disharmonious. The extremes are not properly balanced. Okay, so that's what Aristotle's talking about. In other words, he's not saying, well, by nature, you're suited to one thing, just stay there. He's, first of all, in sharp contrast to Plato, who suggests pretty explicitly that only a tiny number of people in any given society are fit to be involved in politics. Aristotle argues that by nature, we should all be involved in public life, that that's the highest evolutionary stage of the species, is the public man and woman, the public being. Okay, in other words, your private life should not in that sense be more important than your obligations to the public as a citizen. And so he's much more about participation, active participation in public life, not in all public life, but in those elements of public life where you have an understanding and you have something at stake. And again, I told you that one of the legacies of that kind of thinking that is still with us is a jury trial. Okay, none of you, I shouldn't say that, should not say that, but few of you will become judges, professional judges. Okay, but all of you are eligible to serve on a jury, either a civil or criminal jury trial or a grand jury or something like that. Okay, and those are still kind of chosen, at least initially, by lot. Okay, you're drawn and then you're contacted. Now, there's some manipulation that goes on with the construction of juries in a civil and criminal trial, much less so with a grand jury. The thing about a grand jury is if you're chosen, you give them a compelling reason why you can't serve, or you serve, and that's it. In other words, the district attorney can't come in and look at me and say, Hughes, I don't want you on this jury because you're a political scientist and you guys are a pain in the ass. I don't want to deal with that. I can't persuade you. They can't do that. That's corrupt. Okay. Well, that's a legacy of this thinking that is essentially Aristotelian, that it's part of our nature to be public animals, public beings. We're not just private people. Okay. For Plato, right, it's not inaccurate to say that unless you are one of that upper stratum of guardians, you're not that concerned with public life. Even if you're one of the auxiliaries or warriors, you're not considered, relevant to public affairs. You're just enforcing the rules as laid down by the guardians. You don't worry about their public implications. You follow orders because you're trying to keep the city secure, both from those without who would do it harm and from the destabilizers within who would dissent and cause disharmony, right? But if you're a producer, and presumably that's going to be the vast majority of a given political society, you're not a political being at all. You just make shoes or whatever it is you do. You pump gas or you build cars or whatever, and that's it. You're not political. He does not acknowledge an organic, natural, human element of social and political obligation and hence social and political participation in the way that Aristotle does. That's one of the most important differences between them. Okay. Does Plato talk about economic class in the way that Aristotle does? Isabel says no, and leaves us all wondering, okay, what are you eating and did you bring enough for everyone? All right. So you got one of your cohort says no. You are doing a thing, by the way, that people in group theory refer to as free riding, where if, and you're also conceding to what Robert Michel's called the iron law of oligarchy. You are demonstrating why democracies would fail if not for an elite in any setting, because there's a natural, apparently, human propensity to defer to others to lead, in this case by responding to questions. So one of the cool things about when I teach, I get to observe the very phenomena I'm trying to teach. But what if I were to say to you, oh no, you're absolutely wrong. He's talking about socioeconomic class. Is there anything in there that would make you think that? We know it's there with Aristotle because, Owen, among others, has pointed out, he talks specifically about the rich, the poor, and the middle class. That's socioeconomic class.
Plato seems to talk a lot more about societal roles than societal class.
Yeah, he does. I think that's the important distinction. For him, all economics is involved in the producer class only, the producer stratum of society. That anything involving the economy, just the simple material phenomena associated with life is dealt with by that class. Now, within that, there may be richer and poorer merchants and things like that. He shows no interest in that. He doesn't seem to think it's very important, in part because I think he's assuming, well, those are producers. By nature, they'll figure out whatever's going on there. But that's, in other words, he would say, those are political questions. Those are private questions. Economics is private. How hard you work, how much you make, how much you charge for your goods or whatever, those are private decisions. That's not part of public life. He seems to imply that with the model that he's building. Okay. So that there is a sphere for private life only among the producers. Because remember, the auxiliaries have no private life. They live in common with each other. They don't even have private sovereignty over their own children. As soon as those kids are born, they're taken away. So they have no private life. They are only public actors, okay? But also, he seems to suggest, and again, you'd have to go into the larger volume of the Republic, but he also seems to suggest there isn't a lot of room for a private life among the elite guardians. Their constant concern is the good of the public, the good of the Republic itself. That's a public concern. That's political, okay? It is political because it's public. So not only does he not really talk much about class, he doesn't allow much space for private life. Now, how many of you feel like, yeah, I could be comfortable in a society where there was really not much private life? That would be cool. I could be a guardian, or, I could be an auxiliary. I can bench press. I could be an auxiliary, because that's one of the things that people often ignore about what Plato's saying here is, in terms of modern societies, ever since the Enlightenment, we are much more obsessed with the individual, which means we're much more obsessed with the private things, the personal things in our lives, okay? Most of you are overwhelmingly predisposed to be most concerned about those things that are private and personal rather than public, okay? In that you are no different from any other generation. Your generation is not any more organically political or disposed toward politics than any of your predecessor generations. And part of that is that you haven't yet really emerged fully into public life, into the sphere of public life. Many of you have just become old enough to be legally able to vote and may not be legally able to run for office yet, okay? But beyond that, very few of you own a home or have your own business or anything that draws you into the public. Even though it may be a private enterprise, it draws you into public life. And so your notion of public life is things like going to public school or maybe going to church in that public community of the church or something. Okay. Does this make sense? In other words, one of the challenges that Aristotle tries to deal with is it's natural for people to, as they mature, to understand their obligations to the public as outweighing their personal desires in many cases. That the best citizen is going to be the citizens whose primary concern, yeah, you got to take care of business at home. There's no question about that. But if you're an adult, if you're a fully functioning citizen, you have to understand and meet the obligations of all citizens to their community, to their society. I don't think we emphasize that very much in the United States. Do you?
No, no, not at all.
You may hear somebody talk about voting. And it's almost like, okay, open the door, come out of the cuckoo clock, cast your ballot, go back in the cuckoo clock, door shuts. We don't need to see you again until 2 years from now.
I was having a discussion with somebody the other day who was like, going on about how like their votes, on a big national level they don't feel like they make much impact. They feel like they don't have much of a voice because, it's like everything is already corrupt or whatever, like those decisions aren't left to me. And they're so I can't make a change. And I'm like, well, have you ever gone to like a city council meeting or anything? Have you ever gone to try to change anything on a local level, like get a pothole fixed? And they're like, oh no. Like they had no interest in that. Like, well, that's something that you can do. That's easy. You can show up and have a voice.
Well, it's a good point. I think I would say a critical mass of American nominal adults, people who call themselves adults and are chronologically adults, are still essentially politically children in the sense that they're still waiting for some manifestation of mommy and daddy to take care of those things for them, right? I mean, it's strange too, because for all that we emphasize freedom, okay, there's so much about our society that is not free. That's the case with any society. Most other societies, even complex industrial societies, don't struggle nearly as much with that as Americans do. Because the idea is that in most other industrial societies, probably Britain being maybe the exception to this, there's much more of a sense that you learn as you're going through your education and most of the values of your family that, there are things you got to give back to society. You're part of a society. You're not just a private individual. But I don't think anyone as a society is more obsessed with privacy than the United States, which is interesting because when you think about it, so little of what we actually do is authentically private, especially now. I mentioned this in my IS 250 class this morning, and I got nothing, but maybe it's because it's an international studies class rather than American politics, primarily, or theory anyway. And I mentioned that Samsung this is a drag because Samsung makes great televisions. They've just put out a new line of smart televisions, right? But what these things do, part of their smartness is as soon as you connect them, to the evil interwebs out there, they actually track, among other things, they track all of your programming choices. They compile data on everything you watch on that television. Now they swear up and down, but we don't sell those data. We just have them. Well, what they use it for is to target you for advertising and things like that. But what that means is that if you've got a new Samsung Smart TV, right, and you're watching it, what you're doing is not private. It's not. But the funny thing is, it's not quite public either. It's just not private. Every time you get online, you're not private. Every time, unless you're on the dark web, which is hard to do. It's hard to do, but you're not private. Your internet provider has records of everything you do, okay? But most of you never think about that. And yet, if you ask, we know this from survey data, if you ask Americans, one of the things that Americans value, unusually, is privacy. Much more so than I want to participate in public life, even if it sounds good. The thing that Americans seem to value most is some notion of personal privacy. Okay, and it's exactly what B just said. It's because we've really got this this notion of individualism philosophically built into the American Republic. And it's funny because if you look at the Constitution, especially absent the Bill of Rights, you don't see a lot of guarantees for individuals in there. You don't see a lot of concern about individuals in there. The primary concerns of the original draft of the American Constitution are for a vibrant international commerce, a strong integrated national economy that can, compete internationally, commercially. All right, that's what most of the original powers of Congress are designed to do. And it's only when you get the Bill of Rights that you get, for example, those First Amendment rights we think about, free speech, the right to assemble, under the law, of course, peacefully, to petition the government for redress of grievance. A lot of those things, by the way, were not so much intended to apply just to individuals, but to individuals acting collectively. Okay, it was a response to things like Shays' Rebellion. Okay, we got to give these people a vent or an outlet, a recourse for their grievances. Okay, but we have to be able to channel that so they don't destroy the republic. Okay, and it's because we've got this notion of being individuals, and that individualism is the most important thing. Okay, now that's not going to be the same if you go to other societies. Okay, but for Plato, individualism really only exists somewhere where we can't see it within the producer class. There is no individualism among the auxiliaries, the warriors. And there really isn't any individualism in terms of interest or desire among the elite, guardians. Because remember, their primary pursuit is not, oh, well, I want to be acknowledged as great, or I want to have a good reputation, or I want to be wealthy. It's, I want to find the truth. And I will sacrifice in order to find the truth, in the same way that a warrior will sacrifice in order to protect the security of the city. The producer will sacrifice in order to gain wealth, and that's a private affair. Does the distinction make sense, by the way? What do you think about that? I mean, do you think of, when you think of your own life or the social circle within which you move, what would you say is the primary motivator of people's actions? What?
Their own individual interests.
Individual interests?
So that's probably the biggest one.
What about things like, principle or ethics or morality, things that are not individual, things that are social?
Yeah, that's tricky. I'd say that's certainly a factor for a lot of people, but it might not be as big a one as their own individual interests.
And again, the idea is then that the primary motivators for our action in modern life, at least in the United States, are private, right? That we value primarily our existence as private persons, pursuing our own individual interests, which disproportionately are going to be, at least Plato would say, are going to be material. I know I'm doing well because I just got a new TV, or I know I'm doing well because I just got a new Stratocaster, or whatever. It satisfies me personally. You can buy happiness. You can. It's $2,700. Of course it is. Can you buy happiness?
To a point.
No, come on, let's not equivocate. Not to a point. You either can or you can't. Come on, Jason.
Okay, I would say yes, in general, you can.
Okay. Yeah, I would say that you can buy things that make you feel happy. Is that the same thing as buying happiness?
Not really.
What would Aristotle say? Would Aristotle say that you can buy happiness? What do you think? What I'm trying to do here, by the way, I'm not just riffing. One of the ways I found that I began to learn philosophy better in theory was to try to think like that person. So try to understand why they drew the conclusions they did. So would Plato say that you can buy happiness?
He'd be more likely to than Aristotle, I'd say.
Well, he would if you were a producer, probably.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that would
Right.
be, yeah, I would say that's a tentative yes. Yeah, for producers, yeah, presumably. In other words, will material things make you happy? Yeah. Do you think Aristotle would agree with that?
Not really.
No.
Why not? Why would he not?
His whole thing seems to be about like devotion, you know, to obligations to public life, and that like you know, that's what creates a healthy society, is more of like a collective interest.
Well, I think what he would say is something like that. And I think what he would probably say is, well, it may be that the acquisition of a material thing as part of your life might indeed give you a sense of contentment, but it won't be sufficient, because that would mean that your life was out of balance, that the material desires of your life were outweighing your public obligations or your participation in public life. Okay, that a life well lived is a life lived in balance. And to just go off into obsessive private acquisition is to put your life out of balance. And ultimately, he would argue, that is not a life well lived. And so properly understood, you could not be happy. Even if you had, intermittent sensations of contentment because you possess something that you didn't possess before, ultimately, it will not yield the kind of contentment of a life well lived, because you will be out of balance. I think that would be Aristotle's response, because he doesn't just see any class of people as just a material class. Now, we know, though, that the primary tension in most societies, he says, is about wealth. So there is a material element, and he's saying it's a material element that destabilizes public life, right? That the few who've concentrated wealth, the wealthy people, are going to fear the poor and or have contempt for them, okay? And so they're going to try to pull the government in the direction of sort of protecting their personal wealth and their status within that society that's derived from that wealth. The poor are going to resent the wealthy and covet their wealth because they're poor, right? What they're going to try to do is compel the government to respond to that by presumably, say, redistributing that wealth, giving it to the poor, taking it away from the rich, okay? Either one of those, Aristotle seems to suggest, is a society out of balance. It may be inevitable if you don't have a middle class, but it's also going to mean you're going to have a lot of instability. You're going to have conflict. It's going to be hard for you to get things done. If, on the other hand, you have a middle class, the interest of which is to stabilize society and keep everything going, that middle class is going to help balance out the hunger of the poor and the fear of the wealthy, in terms of creating a public environment where those things can be resolved short of violence. Okay, that's his thinking. So that the key there would be, whatever you do, you have to keep in balance. And so ultimately, he probably would say, no, money ain't going to buy you happiness. In fact, all it's really going to do in excess is make you fearful of the few, not the few who have it, but of the many who have not. And that's not a life well lived. All right. Is there anything else, either from the videos, presumably that some of you have not watched, or the readings, that you would like to discuss before I turn you loose to do this assignment?
I just had a little bit of a question about like Plato talking about, people following the nature of their soul and the three roles. I mean, he talks about how like the philosophers are the only ones who can know anything at all because their mind is trained to grasp the pure forms or whatever. I mean, is he basically saying that like you are born a certain way, like it's just nature, you're born to be a philosopher, or you're born to be this, or can you train your mind?
Well,
you have something else.
It's sort of like if you're born with a propensity to athleticism, that doesn't make you great at any individual athletic endeavor. It means you've got an advantage over the rest of us who are just naturally mediocre athletes. But in order for you to excel, to realize the ultimate of your ability, you have to be properly trained. So I would say that, first of all, Plato would not say that only the guardians are capable of knowing anything. What they'd say is only the guardians are capable of knowing and understanding the truth. Right? And a producer knows how to make shoes, but a producer probably doesn't know much else. And if you think about it, really, if you think about, even though we have this sort of mandatory public education, more or less through grade 12 and everything else, I mean, you start to realize after a while that we don't have a really necessarily a really knowledgeable population. Most of us don't know very much about science. We don't know very much about our own history. It's amazing how little Americans know about their own history. We certainly don't know much about the rest of the world. And yet, even graduating from college, as about 30% of us will, or more, maybe, we aren't a conspicuously knowledgeable people. So one part of this is that education can only take you so far. And Plato would say that, you know, you're kind of squandering all but the most rudimentary education on a producer. They're just, by their nature, the way they're born, the way they're made, it's wasted on them. It's not their fault. They're not bad. It's just not in their nature to spend an inordinate amount of time and resources in training their minds. You just want to make sure that they have skillful hands and that they're clever with things. And that can be trained as well. For the auxiliaries, you need to discipline their minds, okay? You don't want to confuse them with lots of deep philosophical questions because they're not predisposed to want to do that anyway. But they need to understand strategy and tactics, and they need to be physically disciplined, and they need to be rigorously trained not to fear. And, you know, to understand that in a given crisis, they don't think they know to act. If you think about military training, that's what that's for. The idea is, look, you don't think about this. I mean, in fact, if you've ever played particularly a collision sport, so if you've ever, I'd even grant soccer, but they pretend to fall down all the time anyway. But like if you've played football, one of the things in there is you do these brutal, repetitive, physically demanding things. Okay, it's not just because your coaches all hate you. All right, that's only part of the reason. The other reason is that in that chaos that is 22 people slamming into each other, you don't have time to think. And so you have to know, in this situation, I need to do this thing. I know what the rules are. I know what the playbook says I'm supposed to be. You've got to have that playbook in your head. And you're not thinking about it, you're following it. Okay, so most of the population under Plato would not be so much educated as trained. Okay, I mean, obviously you need some language skills. You may need to write to be a merchant or something like that. So we'd have to teach you how to write, but we don't and so read, but we don't necessarily have to teach you literature. And where we do offer you, say, poetry or something like that, that poetry is simply, the function of it is to reinforce what we're trying to teach you about your proper role in society. It can't challenge that. So you couldn't, for example, have a play in a Platonic Republic where someone came from the producer class and fought their way up, you know, through the auxiliaries to become a guardian. You know, there's no Spartacus here. Okay, can't have that, because that violates the entire philosophical premise of his model. Every once in a great while will somebody who is a natural, you know, auxiliary be born to the producer class? Yeah, and you know who will know right away? The wisest people. But other than that, no, we don't make that decision ourselves. That's left to the people above us. Okay, does that help?
Yeah.
Anything else?
So when Owen was talking about like the three parts of the soul, so Plato was saying that philosophers have all three parts. Is he
Everybody
saying,
has all three parts to some extent.
but he was saying that philosophers specifically have that part. So is he saying that like they're more powerful than like the rulers? Does that make any sense?
No, they are the rulers. This republic is going to be governed by philosophers.
Okay, the way I read it, I thought he meant that like they were above. It was confusing a little bit to me. I thought that he meant that the rulers were like a separate group than the philosophers.
Not really, no. Because the idea there's now, in other words, out of a class of philosophers may be chosen a ruler. They may decide, you know what, you should step forward. It might be you three as some sort of ruling triumvirate, or it might be an individual or something like that. But essentially the guardians are people who have that extraordinary capacity to philosophy. He's also not saying, for example, that an auxiliary or a producer has no concept of wisdom. There is a wisdom required of a producer. You have to know, you have to have business acumen. You have to understand what would be good or bad business practices. That's a kind of wisdom. It's not so much a pursuit of the truth as it is an understanding of what works and what doesn't. It's a kind of practicality, okay? For an auxiliary, the wisdom is in understanding your nature, okay, but also in understanding in a given moment, okay, this is what we need to do when we see this situation, because, you know, there's going to be a command structure of some kind within the auxiliaries. There is. It's going to arise organically. Somebody somewhere is going to issue orders, and it's not going to be some philosopher. But what he's trying to say is that the disproportionate energy of the ruling class is going to be that intellectual pursuit of the truth, which is by definition philosophy. Yeah. And it's one of those things that isn't often clearly explained, because yeah, some people will draw the conclusion that somewhere out there, somewhere is this cohort of philosophers. Clearly they are not auxiliaries and they're not producers, okay? But what he's really saying is there's a rarefied stratum of people at the top of the pyramid who are enlightened in the way that only philosophers can be. And it will be, just think of it as out of that cohort of people, the leadership of the Republic will naturally emerge through whatever process is institutionalized. Yeah. I mean, at this level, that's sufficient to be going on with, you know. I mean, remember too, that there are still like people in graduate school who are arguing these things. You know, they have nothing better to do. And I don't, you know, so I sort of want to avoid that. If you're curious about this and you want to go deeper into these things, think about taking one of the philosophy classes from, say, Prakash or somebody like that, or Dvora. You know, I think Prakash primarily does sort of classical philosophy. So if you were doing Plato or Aristotle, I think you would probably be working with him. But that would be the way to go, okay? What I'm trying to do is give you kind of the 40,000-foot flyover so that you can see how these modes of thinking apply to politics. Whereas if you take it from Prakash, he's not just going to stop with politics. He's going to talk about, you know, issues of morality, ethics, all kinds of things. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I don't mean to be oversimplifying, but I'm saying for purposes of what we're doing, I'm giving you a fairly unadorned view of these philosophies. Otherwise, I mean, we could spend an entire term just talking about these two philosophers, but we have other things we have to do as well. But that's, no, it's a perfectly fair question. I like the fact that you're thinking deconstructively. You're trying to make sense of the model by taking the pieces apart. That's what I am encouraging you to do. Yeah. Anything else? All right then. At some point, sooner rather than later, I would take a look at the Moodle page, maybe make some notes, then maybe go back and maybe look at those videos again. They're both really short. Take notes from those. And then glance at the notes, you know, the on Plato's Republic and the ones on Aristotle's Politics. I'll be willing to respond to questions up through Saturday. Like even Saturday day, not like, I mean, not all day Saturday, but like if you shoot me an email Friday night and I don't get it because I'm asleep or something, I'll respond to it Saturday day. So if you have follow-up questions like the one that, for example, the one that Bea just asked, you know, if that suddenly occurs to you Friday night, fire off an email to me. I'll either get it that night or I'll get it the next day and respond to you. Otherwise, I'm going to turn you loose on it. And then starting next week, we're going to be going into Machiavelli. I think a lot of you will find Machiavelli very familiar. And I think in a weird way, you'll be very comfortable with it. It's much more modern theory than any of the idealistic kind of stuff that we've dealt with so far. Okay. Other than that, although it sounds a little early, have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.